There's something about the quiet after a storm that unsettles me. Like the world is holding its breath, waiting for what comes next. In the vast stillness of the Cutter Ranch, I'm beginning to wonder if the silence is hiding something I'm not meant to hear. If you're intrigued by what's to come, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into mystery, heartache, and unexpected connections. Boaz Cutter wasn't a man who easily relied on others, but he had come to realize that this ranch, as grand as it was, could not run itself. Not without the right hands, strong, steady, and willing to put in the hard work. He wasn't blind to the solitude he carried like a second skin, but there were other ways to fill the silence than to try and chase it away. That's why he hired Abigail Turner. She came to him, a widow with soft hands and a soft smile, her skills in the kitchen rumored to be worth more than any gold he had on this land. What Boaz didn't expect, however, was how quickly the taste of her cooking seemed to settle into his bones, filling a hunger he hadn't known he had. It wasn't just the savory smell of beef stew and fresh bread that lingered in the air after every meal. It was the feeling of something warm, something hopeful, that he hadn't felt in years. His life had been filled with the constant noise of cattle, the creaking of the barn doors, and the whistling winds of the plains. Yet, none of it could replace the quiet, simple comfort that Abigail brought when she smiled across the kitchen table, offering him nothing more than kindness, something he hadn't received in far too long. Abigail hadn't expected much when she took the job. A roof over her head, a warm meal, and the quiet peace of working for a man who didn't ask much of her beyond the basics of the kitchen. What she didn't expect was how the giant of a man who owned the ranch, who stood tall in her presence with the weight of the world on his shoulders, had become a man she couldn't help but notice. Boaz Cutter was more than just a rancher. He was a man who had weathered storms of his own, storms that Abigail was beginning to suspect went far deeper than the land he worked. And though her days were filled with the rhythmic chop of knives on vegetables and the heat of the stove, the real work was done when the sun dipped below the horizon, and she found herself asking questions about him she hadn't intended to. Why did a man like Boaz Cutter, so used to solitude, seem so starved for something more? Why did she feel drawn to him, even when it made no sense at all? She wasn't the only one with questions. As days turned into weeks, Boaz began to notice that the meals she made weren't the only thing that satisfied him. It was her presence, her smile, her soft laugh that cut through the silence. It wasn't supposed to matter. They had an agreement. He paid her well, and she made sure his belly was full. But what started as a practical arrangement began to feel like something more. Something dangerous. He never asked for this, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface, this connection. Something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Each time she walked past him, the air seemed to change. The tension was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, thick like the prairie dust that always found its way into the house. And as much as he tried to convince himself that it was just the loneliness of two souls trapped in a vast, empty place, something told him it was more. A hunger, not for food, but for something deeper, something he hadn't realized he needed until she came into his life. Something he hadn't known was missing until she smiled. He could no longer pretend he didn't notice how her smile, the way it brightened her whole face, seemed to draw him in. He could no longer ignore how his heart would race a little faster when she placed a plate in front of him, as if that meal was only the beginning of something else, something he wasn't ready for, but couldn't escape. It wasn't until one evening, after a long day of tending to the cattle and repairing fences, that Boaz found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her work. The setting sun cast a golden hue on her auburn hair as she stirred a pot of something fragrant, humming a tune under her breath. The simplicity of the moment, a woman in the kitchen, a man standing in the doorway, the unspoken understanding that this was their shared space, felt almost surreal. There was a comfort in it, yes, but also something else. A question he wasn't prepared to answer. Was this just a job for her, as she claimed? Or was there something more she wasn't telling him, something he was too afraid to ask? And if there was, could he handle it? The quietness of the ranch had always been his companion, but now, with Abigail's smile lighting up the room, the silence felt like something more, a space where all his unspoken fears and desires found room to breathe. And for the first time in years, Boaz Cutter, the man who had spent a lifetime alone, found himself wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life by hiring her. Not because of her cooking, not because of her charm, but because she had stirred something in him that he hadn't known he'd been starving for. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Abigail set the table for another meal, Boaz found himself stuck between the comfort of familiarity and the unsettling weight of what was beginning to unfold between them. Would this simple, practical arrangement turn into something more? Or would it crumble under the weight of their own unspoken truths? The mystery was only beginning, and he had no idea just how much it would change them both. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, morning chores, evening meals, and the endless hum of the wind that seemed to whisper secrets across the plains. But something had shifted between Boaz and Abigail, a quiet tension that neither of them acknowledged directly, yet it lingered in every glance, in every shared silence. The kitchen had become their unofficial meeting place, the one space where they could exist in the same room without saying much, yet everything was said with the glances that passed between them. Boaz couldn't shake the feeling that his growing attraction to Abigail wasn't just a fleeting fancy, a simple byproduct of loneliness. No, this was something deeper, something he hadn't expected when he hired her to cook, and certainly not something he was prepared to deal with. Abigail, for her part, tried her best to ignore the fluttering in her chest whenever Boaz was near. She had made peace with the fact that the job was just that, a job, and that Boaz was her employer, a man who had hired her out of necessity, not desire. But every time their eyes met, every time he lingered just a second too long in the doorway, she couldn't help but feel something stir inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since her husband had passed. She had learned the hard way not to expect too much from life, to be grateful for what she had, and not long for things that could never be. Yet, the more time she spent with Boaz, the more she began to wonder if maybe she had been wrong. Maybe there could be more than just the silence of widowhood. Maybe there could be warmth, companionship, maybe even love. One evening, after a particularly hard day of cattle herding and repairs on the barn, Boaz found himself restless. The wind was particularly biting, a sharp reminder that winter was just around the corner. As he walked toward the kitchen, he heard the familiar sound of Abigail humming softly as she chopped vegetables. The rhythm of her knife against the cutting board, the faint melody she hummed, it was all oddly comforting. It reminded him of the life he had long buried beneath the dust and grit of the ranch. The life that didn't revolve around work, but around connection. Boaz leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You always hum when you cook?" His voice was low, more of a statement than a question, but it seemed to catch Abigail off guard. She looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments before she quickly returned to her task. "It helps pass the time," she said with a half-smile, though her cheeks flushed slightly. "And it keeps me from thinking too much." About what? Boaz couldn't help himself. He wanted to know. He wanted to understand the woman who had so easily found a way into his quiet, solitary life. Abigail hesitated for a moment, the weight of his question settling in the space between them. She had never been good at sharing her inner thoughts, especially with someone she barely knew. But there was something in his gaze, something kind, that made her want to tell him. To let him see the woman beyond the kitchen apron, beyond the widow. "About being alone," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've gotten used to it, but it doesn't make it any easier." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and vulnerable. Boaz felt a pang in his chest, a recognition that they both carried the same loneliness, though they wore it in different ways. He had built his life around the hard work of the ranch, convinced that it was enough to keep the ache at bay. She, on the other hand, had built a life around the silence of widowhood, convinced that it was all she would ever have. Neither of them had known the other would step into their lives and disrupt the carefully built walls they had created to keep out the pain of longing. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Boaz said quietly, stepping further into the kitchen. I don't know what it is about you, Abigail. It's like you've brought something into this house I didn't know I needed. Something I've been starving for." Abigail's heart skipped a beat at his words. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the way her breath seemed to catch in her throat. This was it, she thought. This was the moment where everything changed, where the quiet tension that had been building between them either broke open into something real or stayed locked behind the walls they had built around their hearts. "I don't want to make things complicated," she said, her voice steady but hesitant. "This is just a job, Boaz. Nothing more. We both agreed on that." "I know," he said, his voice low and serious. "But what if it could be something more? What if we both needed more than just this arrangement? More than just the silence?" Abigail couldn't meet his eyes. She was afraid if she did, she might see something in them she wasn't ready to face. So instead, she focused on the task in front of her, her hands working the knife with practiced precision. "I think we both know this can't go anywhere, Boaz. I'm a widow. You're a man with your own life, your own world. We don't fit into each other's." Boaz took a step closer, the warmth of his presence drawing her in. "I don't believe that. Maybe we're not the same, but maybe we don't need to be. Maybe we just need to take the chance." There was a long pause, the weight of his words hanging in the air like the promise of something that could be, something neither of them had ever expected. Abigail felt her pulse quicken, the undeniable pull between them becoming impossible to ignore. "Are you saying," she started, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to ask the question she was afraid of knowing the answer to. Boaz placed a hand gently on the edge of the table, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm saying that sometimes the things we don't expect are the things that change us the most. Maybe we're both just waiting for the right moment to stop pretending." Abigail's breath caught in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she could let herself believe it. But in that moment, staring into his eyes, she knew something had shifted, and there was no going back. The kitchen, once just a space for meals and solitude, now felt like something more, a place where two people, once strangers, were beginning to realize that the quiet, simple connection they shared might just be the very thing they had both been craving. And for the first time in a long while, Abigail allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Boaz Cutter was the answer to a question she hadn't even known she was asking. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken understanding, a quiet connection that neither Abigail nor Boaz could ignore. Every glance shared over the dinner table, every brief touch as they passed each other in the hall, deepened the bond between them. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their daily lives now intertwined in a way neither of them had expected. Boaz continued his duties on the ranch, but his thoughts often drifted to Abigail, her smile, her laugh, the way she moved around the house as if it was her home. It was a quiet intimacy, one that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, as Abigail finished preparing another hearty meal, Boaz found himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen once again. He watched her for a moment, the soft light from the oil lamp casting shadows across her face. There was something so peaceful, so right about this moment, about them. The words he had been avoiding hung between them, unspoken, but understood. "Abigail," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "I don't want this to just be a job anymore." She turned, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. "What do you mean?" I think I've been fooling myself. Us, it's more than just an arrangement. I don't want to let you go." The weight of his confession hung in the air, and for the first time, Abigail felt her own walls begin to crumble. She wasn't sure what this was, or where it would lead, but she knew it was something she didn't want to lose. "I don't want to be alone anymore either," she whispered. Boaz took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Then don't be." And just like that, with a single, quiet promise, the world around them shifted. The quiet ranch, once filled with the sound of solitude, was now filled with the promise of something more, a future neither of them had expected, but both were willing to build together.